So if you want to learn how to swim, you can sit on the edge of the pool and just read a comprehensive textbook on fluid dynamics.
Right, like you can memorize the exact coefficient of drag.
Exactly. You study the perfect geometry of a freestyle stroke, master the physics of buoyancy, all of that. And sitting there, dry on the tiles, you might actually convince yourself that you completely understand water.
Yeah, you build this perfectly frictionless mathematical model of swimming in your head. Like the logic is flawless.
But the very second you actually jump into the deep end, the water rushes up your nose, the temperature completely shocks your system, and you are just thrashing around.
You instantly realize your abstract theory is, well, entirely different from the physical, messy reality of trying to stay afloat.
Because the water doesn't care about your textbook. It only responds to the actual physical force you exert against it.
And that moment of shock, that collision between thinking about the world and actually crashing into the material reality of the world, that is the exact focal point of our exploration today.
It really is. Today, we are taking a massive deep dive into one of the most fundamental, keep-you-up-at-night questions of human existence, which is, how do you actually know what you know?
Right. What is the actual mechanism of truth?
We are exploring epistemology, the theory of knowledge, by opening up a pretty formidable stack of historical and philosophical texts from the MECW, the Marx and Engels collected works.
And before we wade into these waters, we do have to acknowledge the gravity of this terrain.
Oh, absolutely.
Because the sources we are looking at today contain highly politically charged content. These specific texts have sparked massive global movements, revolutions, and intense historical debate that touches every single nerve on both the left and right wings of the political spectrum.
Which is exactly why our mission today requires strict neutrality. Just to be clear for everyone listening, we are not here to take political sides, endorse any movement, or condemn an ideology.
Definitely not. We are treating these texts as artifacts of philosophical history.
Right. Our goal is purely to impartially report on the content. We just want to break down the underlying logic of this specific epistemology and understand what these authors actually argued on their own terms.
Yeah, we're basically looking at the architecture of their thought, specifically how they attempted to, rip philosophy down from the clouds of abstraction and force it into the dirt of practical human action.
So if you have ever sat in a corporate strategy meeting or a university seminar or just observed a debate online and felt completely overwhelmed by these endless floating theories that seem entirely untethered from reality, stick with us.
Because we are going to trace a journey from early critiques of abstract philosophy all the way through mature texts like the German ideology and Ludwig Feuerbach and the end of classical German philosophy.
And we're going to uncover a really concrete, grounding solution to that feeling of intellectual vertigo.
I think the best place to start is by examining what these texts consider the original sin of philosophy, which is the illusion of pure thought.
Okay, let's unpack that.
Historically, epistemology has been this brutal battleground between two main camps. On one side, you have idealism, which argues that thinking dictates reality.
Right, so the mind or the spirit is primary and the physical world is just a secondary reflection of that thought.
Yeah, exactly. And then on the other side, materialism argues that reality dictates thinking. The physical world exists independently, and human thought is merely a reflection of that material reality.
And in the early volumes of these sources, we see an absolutely relentless critique of German idealist philosophers. They primarily focus on giants like Schelling and Hegel.
Yeah, because for the idealists, the mind was the undisputed center of the universe. They were essentially attempting to deduce the entire nature of reality purely from internal logic, from what they called self-consciousness.
The critique leveled at Hegel here is fascinating, I think, because it strikes right at the core of human identity.
It really does. The text argues that Hegel basically substitutes a floating, abstract self-consciousness for real, living, breathing human beings.
He dissolves the sensuous, physical, bleeding world into this ether of pure thought.
And you kind of have to understand the philosophical appeal of this, right? If the universe is fundamentally logical, if it is just this grand unfolding of a cosmic mind, then a philosopher sitting in a quiet room can theoretically comprehend the entire universe just by thinking hard enough.
It totally flatters the intellectual. It makes the thinker a god of their own universe.
It does, but the texts point out the catastrophic flaw in this approach. Because if you truly believe that the mind alone generates reality, you risk becoming trapped in an inescapable illusion.
Right, you become disconnected from the physical limits, the actual material conditions, and frankly, the profound suffering of the real world.
Exactly. If reality is merely a thing of thought, as the critique phrases it, then logical problems can be solved with logical thoughts without ever having to physically interact with or change the material world.
And this philosophical disconnect generates some of the sharpest, just most biting analogies in the source material. Like, Marx tackles this with the example of the imagined thalers.
Oh, I love this one.
Yeah, so a thaler was the currency of the day. And he poses this scenario where you imagine you have 100 thalers, and you don't just passively think about them. Your belief in this wealth is so overwhelming, so deeply held, that you genuinely consider it real.
You might even go down to a tavern and try to incur debt based on this intense imagination.
Right. You operate in the world based entirely on the construct of your self-consciousness. Your imagination will certainly act as a catalyst for your own actions. You will confidently order a drink.
But the moment the bill comes,
The real world crashes down on you with the weight of an anvil. The real tellers in the tavern owner's pocket have a completely different objective existence than the imagined money floating in your head.
you cannot pay a material debt with pure thought.
You just can't. The physical world forcefully overrides the subjective belief.
And Engels uses a similarly devastating analogy when he goes after Schelling. Because Schelling was trying to argue that reality must naturally flow out of logical premises.
Right.
So, Engels mocks this by calling it the demand of the barren apple tree. He points out the absurdity of expecting that real reason should produce unreal, merely logical results.
It's just a hilarious visual.
It really is. Engels says it would be like looking at a physical apple tree in your garden and expecting it to grow potential, logical apples.
Right. If an apple tree fails to produce physical fruit and only produces the concept of an apple in the mind of the gardener, we don't praise it as a magnificent manifestation of pure reason. We just call it a barren apple tree and chop it down for firewood.
Exactly. The idealist abstracts everything away. They strip away the bark, the leaves, the soil, the water, until they are left with nothing but the pure, empty concept of a tree.
And then they try to perform this magic trick, attempting to conjure the physical, sensuous world back out of that empty abstraction.
Which the text argues relentlessly against. If you start with an abstract void, you cannot logically arrive at a concrete reality. You must start with what already violently exists.
Okay, let's unpack this with a modern parallel because I think it's so relevant today. Think of a Wall Street quantitative analyst.
Oh, yeah, the quants.
Right. So someone who spends years building a flawlessly elegant, mathematically perfect economic model on a supercomputer.
And in the sterile environment of the software, the logic is unassailable. The algorithms predict human behavior perfectly.
But then they deploy this model into the live market, and the real stock market, which is driven by chaotic, sensuous, irrational human panic, behaves entirely differently.
The model triggers a cascade of automated selling, and you get a massive financial crash.
And in the aftermath, the idealist analyst looks at the devastation and actually blames the real world for failing to behave according to their perfect math.
They substituted their pristine algorithm for the messy reality of human economics. When the model and reality conflict, the idealist assumes reality is broken, but the materialist assumes the model is broken.
So if the algorithm, or pure thought, is a dead end as the starting point of knowledge, we are forced into a corner here. We have to figure out what the true starting point is.
Right. We can't start in the clouds of the intellect. We have to start in the dirt of survival.
And this brings us directly to the foundational premise of their epistemology, heavily detailed in the German ideology.
Yes. The text establishes a rule that completely upends the idealist tradition. The premise is basically this: it is not consciousness that determines life, but life that determines consciousness.
They refuse to define human consciousness as this floating spirit. They define it strictly as conscious being.
Let's look at the mechanics of that. The sources delve into a critique of an academic named Adolf Wagner to illustrate this point, which is really telling.
Yeah, Wagner operated under an assumption that feels very natural to a university professor.
Exactly. He assumed that early humans began their relationship with the outside world in a passive, contemplative, theoretical way.
Like, he envisioned a human encountering the world by first observing it, categorizing the objects around them, assigning them properties, and then deciding how to interact with them based on that logical framework.
Wagner projected the quiet contemplation of a 19th century study room onto the brutal reality of prehistoric human existence.
Which is wild when you think about it.
The texts ruthlessly tear this apart. They argue that humans absolutely do not begin their existence by finding themselves in this theoretical relationship. Think about the biological reality of early hominids.
Right. They don't wake up, look at a beautiful landscape, and posit the ontological existence of a forest.
No, they wake up starving.
Yeah.
They wake up freezing. They wake up terrified of predators.
Like any other animal, they begin by acting. Their very first interaction with the external world is a desperately practical one.
They begin by eating, drinking, seeking shelter, physically fighting for survival. They appropriate the outside world through muscular action long before they ever attempt to understand it theoretically.
So production and consumption come before contemplation. We act before we think.
And the physical actions we take to keep our biology functioning provide the foundational raw material for all subsequent thoughts.
That makes total sense. The linguistic labels, the abstract concepts, the grand philosophical theories, these are all secondary phenomena.
They emerge only after repeated practical interaction. When an early human eats a specific root and it cures their hunger without poisoning them, that physical repetition imprints the capacity of that root to satisfy a human need onto the brain.
But we only assign generic names to objects because our physical metabolic activity has forced them into our tangible experience.
There is a passage in the text that highlights the sheer pragmatism of this process with this really great bit of dry humor.
Oh, the sheep example.
Yes, they're discussing how humans naturally label things as useful based on the practical experience of consuming them. And the text notes that it would hardly occur to a sheep that one of its useful qualities is that it can be eaten by human beings.
I love that. The concept of usefulness isn't some magical intrinsic property radiating from the sheep, just waiting to be discovered by a passive observer.
Right. It is a strictly relational category, forged in the violent necessary act of a human eating the sheep to avoid starvation. Language and concepts are essentially the crystallized echoes of repeated material practice.
Okay, wait. I struggle with this framing just a bit, and I can hear someone listening right now raising an objection.
Go for it.
If every thought I possess, all my intricate concepts, all my supposedly transcendent theories of justice or beauty or mathematics are ultimately just biological echoes of physical survival, doesn't that horribly diminish the human mind?
That's a really fair question.
Because it paints a picture of humanity as nothing more than a complex network of stimulus response machines, entirely enslaved by our stomachs. Does this framework cheapen the intellect?
That is definitely the most common instinctive recoil against materialism. But the texts argue that this perspective achieves the exact opposite. Reading consciousness in material life doesn't diminish the mind. It rescues the mind from fantasy and arms it with a genuine mechanism for power.
Okay, but how does being tied to biology give us power?
Because if your ideas are just floating independently in a spiritual ether, disconnected from reality, you are essentially a prisoner to whatever thoughts happen to drift into your head. You have no leverage over them.
Right.
But if your intellect is anchored in material reality, you possess a tangible lever to pull. It reveals a profound mechanical truth. If you want to fundamentally change your mind or change the consciousness of a whole society, you cannot achieve it by simply debating concepts in a vacuum.
You must first alter the material circumstances, the physical daily practice of that society.
Exactly. It grounds human agency in the physical world. It's the difference between trying to wish away a fire using pure thought versus understanding the chemical combustion of the fire and physically throwing water on it.
The latter requires physical labor, but it actually extinguishes the flames.
Precisely. It gives the mind a territory where its actions have real consequences. But this reliance on the physical world introduces a massive epistemological hurdle.
Right, because if our entire capacity for knowledge is shackled to our physical experience and our biological senses, what happens when we encounter the formidable philosophical argument that the physical world is, at its deepest level, fundamentally unknowable to those very senses?
And this is where we hit the skeptics. In the text Ludwig Feuerbach and the End of Classical German Philosophy, Engels takes on a group of thinkers that really act as the ultimate buzzkills of epistemology.
The agnostics.
Yep. David Hume, Immanuel Kant, the agnostics, and the neo-Kantians.
These thinkers, particularly Kant, advanced a highly influential and incredibly durable idea. They argued that human beings can certainly perceive the qualities of an object, its color, its shape, its weight, how it reacts chemically to other objects.
However, Kant argued that time, space, and causality aren't objective features of the universe. They are subjective cognitive structures built into the human mind.
Right. Our senses act as an inescapable processing filter. Because we can only ever perceive the world through the operating system of the human brain, we can never bypass that system to grasp what Kant called the thing in itself.
We can never know the true, ultimate, objective reality of an object independent of our observation of it.
I think of it like a computer interface. Like you look at your screen and see a folder icon. You can click the folder, move it, change its color, put files in it. You understand how the folder behaves completely.
But the folder isn't actually a little manila rectangle inside your computer.
Exactly. It is an incredibly complex sequence of electrical currents and binary code interacting with a silicon chip. Our brain is the user interface. We only get to see the icons in the windows.
Yeah.
I can never, ever perceive the binary code of the universe.
We are locked out of base reality.
Then from the perspective of the MECW texts, this agnostic view is not just a frustrating puzzle, it is profoundly dangerous to the trajectory of human progress and scientific discovery.
By claiming the universe has a fundamental, impenetrable barrier to true understanding, agnosticism acts as a paralyzing agent on human endeavor.
But wait, why dangerous? Isn't it just an exercise in philosophical humility, admitting that the human brain has limits and we can't, know the mind of God, so to speak?
The danger lies in how it breeds passivity. If you accept the premise that the deepest mechanisms of the universe are permanently veiled in mystery, and that you are biologically incapable of solving that mystery, the urgent drive to change the world just evaporates.
Ah, I see.
The text refers to this agnosticism with a brilliant, mocking phrase. It calls it a shamefaced way of surreptitiously accepting materialism while denying it before the world.
Shamefaced materialism. Let's unpack the hypocrisy they were pointing out there.
Well, Engels is highlighting the massive disconnect between how these philosophers live and what they teach. In their daily practical lives, these agnostics act entirely like materialists.
They eat physical food to satisfy real hunger.
Exactly. They walk carefully to avoid tripping over real rocks. They don't step off the edge of real cliffs because they respect real gravity. They implicitly trust the objective reality of the material world with every step they take.
But the moment they step up to the lectern in the philosophy hall, they lose their nerve. They suddenly claim the world is just an unknowable appearance.
They rely on the material world to keep their bodies alive, but they refuse to philosophically commit to its objective reality.
To illustrate the real-world cost of this philosophical timidity, the sources point to Kant's own work in astronomy, specifically his nebular hypothesis.
Yes, Kant was a brilliant scientist as well as a philosopher. In 1755, he proposed that the entire solar system, the sun, the planets, the moons, originated from a massive rotating cloud of hot gas and dust, a nebula, which slowly condensed over immense stretches of time.
And the text notes that this was a revolutionary leap for science, right? Because it completely shattered the dominant view of the universe at the time.
It was a monumental paradigm shift. Before Kant, the prevailing Newtonian view was essentially that of a clockwork universe. Nature was seen as an eternal, unchanging, repeating loop.
The assumption was that God had wound up the clock of the solar system at the moment of creation, and it just ticked away, static and unevolving, forever.
But Kant introduced the radical idea that nature actually evolves. He argued that the universe has a history in time, that it develops, changes, and transforms.
It's basically the precursor to modern astrophysics. But here is the tragedy the text points out. Because Kant remained a philosophical idealist, heavily committed to his impenetrable thing in itself, his incredible scientific theory was imprisoned by his own epistemology.
He hit the ceiling of his own philosophical framework. He had mathematically and logically deduced a brilliant theory about the origin of the cosmos. But because he believed that objective reality was fundamentally beyond human grasp, his nebular hypothesis could only ever remain exactly that, a hypothesis.
A very good mathematical guess.
Right. He lacked the epistemological tool to declare it as objective truth about the real universe.
The interface trapped him. He couldn't verify the code. So how do we smash the interface? If Kant argues the universe is a locked box and we can only ever run our hands over the outside of the box, how do we prove the agnostics wrong once and for all?
How do we definitively prove that human beings can know objective reality?
Exactly.
Well, you can't do it by out-arguing them in a debate. You can't outthink the thing in itself. You have to outact it. And this brings us to the absolute climax of this epistemological deep dive.
Here we go.
Engels argues that the ultimate, irrefutable criterion for the cognizability of the world, the proof that we can know it, is practical human activity. He writes, the most telling refutation of this, as of all other philosophical quirks, is practice, namely experimentation and industry.
Experimentation and industry. The laboratory and the factory floor, not the meditation retreat and the logic puzzle.
The argument is incredibly elegant once you grasp the mechanics of it. The unknowable thing in itself, this mysterious black box of reality, ceases to be a mystery the exact moment we can produce it ourselves out of its basic material conditions and force it to serve our own human purposes.
It's a total rejection of the passive observer model. We don't just sit in the audience watching the grand play of nature. We climb onto the stage, grab the props, dismantle the set, and rewrite the script.
And the text emphasizes this heavily, stating that the alteration of nature by men, not solely nature as such, which is the most essential and immediate basis of human thought.
We only truly comprehend a thing when we can master it, build it, and alter it.
And the texts provide two vivid historical examples to anchor this philosophy in the reality of scientific advancement. The first example involves organic chemistry and a substance called alizarin.
Right, alizarin is the organic compound that gives the madder root its vibrant red color. For centuries across various civilizations, this plant extract was highly prized and used extensively to dye fabrics.
But for all those centuries, exactly what made it red, its fundamental chemical essence, was a complete natural mystery. It was a classic Kantian thing in itself.
Humans knew it dyed cloth, they understood its outward behavior, but its inner objective reality was a locked box.
But then field of organic chemistry advanced rapidly.
Mm.
Scientists didn't just passively observe the matter root. They actively experimented. They broke down the molecular structure of alizarin.
And they made the stunning realization they didn't need the actual madder root at all to get the dye. They discovered they could synthesize the exact same chemical structure artificially, and much more cheaply, by manipulating coal tar.
And the moment that happened, the moment a chemist took black, sludgy coal tar, actively manipulated its conditions in a laboratory, and produced pure red alizarin to serve the demands of human industry, the Kantian black box was obliterated.
The thing in itself was forcefully transformed into a thing for us. You cannot rationally maintain that alizarin is an unknowable, mystical reality beyond human comprehension when you are literally manufacturing it by the ton in a chemical plant.
The practical, physical act of creating it proves, definitively, that our mental concept of its molecular chemistry maps perfectly onto the objective reality of the universe.
The second example they provide is even grander in scale, I think. Moving from the microscopic world of chemistry to the microscopic world of astronomy, we have the definitive proof of the Copernican system.
Yeah, this is a great story. For 300 years after Copernicus proposed that the Earth revolves around the sun, the system was technically still a hypothesis.
It was an incredibly robust mathematical model with thousands of chances to one in its favor. It explained the retrograde motion of planets beautifully, but, strictly speaking, it remained a theory.
It was a very compelling interface. But then we have the incredible historical narrative of Urbain Le Verrier and Johann Gall. In the 1840s, Le Verrier, a French mathematician, was obsessively studying the orbit of Uranus.
And he noticed that the planet was wobbling. It wasn't behaving exactly as the Copernican and Newtonian models predicted it should.
Now, an idealist might have said, the math is perfect, the planet is wrong. But Le Verrier trusted the objective reality. He deduced that to make the math work, there must be another, unknown, unseen gravitational mass out there, a new planet, pulling on Uranus.
Using only the theoretical data and the math of the Copernican system, Le Verrier spent months doing excruciatingly complex calculus by hand.
Wow.
He calculated the exact mass this unseen planet must have, and the exact position in the sky where it should be located at a specific time. But at this point, he just had numbers on a page. He had deduced a reality based on a model.
Right. To prove the model, he needed practice. He needed an empirical verification. So he sent his calculations in a letter to the astronomer Johann Galle at the Berlin Observatory.
He essentially told Galle, point your telescope at these exact coordinates tonight and you will see a new planet.
And Galle received the letter, walked into the observatory and the telescope exactly where the math dictated, and looked through the lens.
And right there, less than 1 degree from where Leverrier's equations said it would be, Galle found the gas giant we now call Neptune.
That is the decisive, world-altering moment of practice. When you can use a theoretical framework to not merely explain past observations, but to successfully predict a previously unknown objective reality, and then you verify that reality through empirical technological practice, actually pointing a telescope and observing it, the theoretical system is definitively proven.
The hypothetical becomes the actual. Practice confirms the theory beyond any lingering agnostic doubt. To truly know the world, we have to interact with it, experiment on it, and alter it.
Exactly.
But exploring all this raises a really frustrating paradox for me. If the cure for philosophical confusion is so incredibly obvious, just go out and test your ideas against physical reality. Why do so many brilliant, highly educated people still get trapped in endless, useless, abstract theorizing?
It is a critical question. And the texts don't write this off as individual stupidity or personal failing. They argue that this trap, this tendency to float away into pure theory, is a direct structural result of how human society itself is organized.
Okay, this leads us to their intricate concept of ideology and what they term spurious consciousness.
Yes.
Spurious consciousness. The word spurious means fake or falsely attributed. It's essentially an inverted way of perceiving the world.
They explore how false ideas take root and propagate, not just as random cognitive errors, but as systemic, self-replicating illusions. In the letters, particularly the 1893 correspondence and in the German ideology, ideology is defined specifically as a mental process carried out by a thinker with a spurious consciousness.
The ideologist operates entirely within the realm of conceptual material.
Right.
They assume that their ideas spring purely from their own independent thought process or that they inherited them through a long lineage of previous philosophers' thoughts.
They think history is just a giant, centuries-long debate club of big brains passing abstract concepts down to each other.
Right. They are completely fundamentally ignorant of the actual messy material origins of those ideas.
And the reason this profound ignorance occurs is the historical division of labor. We have to trace this back. In early tribal societies, human survival required everyone to participate in physical labor, hunting, gathering, building shelter. Mental and physical labor were intimately combined in every individual.
But as society develops, agriculture allows for surplus production. That surplus means society can afford to feed certain individuals who do not have to work in the fields. This creates a strict separation between mental labor and physical labor.
Exactly. You see the emergence of a distinct, specialized class: priests, philosophers, lawmakers, and eventually academics, whose entire societal role is purely mental.
And because they are completely divorced from the physical exertion of manual labor, their consciousness begins to alter. As the text puts it, consciousness begins to flatter itself.
I love that phrasing. The consciousness flatters itself that it is something entirely other than the consciousness of existing practice.
Because the philosopher isn't sweating in the factory or bleeding on the battlefield, they forget that their pristine, elegant ideas were ultimately birthed from the dirt, the industry, the violent class struggles, and the economic relations of real life.
They start to believe their thoughts have a magical, independent existence.
The sources provide a really cutting, highly specific example of this with the figure of the judge. The text observes a judge whose entire professional life is spent interpreting and applying the legal code.
Day in and day out, year after year, they deal with statutes, precedents, and legal arguments in the sterile environment of a courtroom.
Because they never step outside this highly specialized, purely mental environment, they naturally begin to view legislation as the ultimate independent driving force of human history. They look at society and think, the law created this.
They completely invert reality. They forget the brutal economic imperatives, the material conditions, and the physical conflicts over resources that actually necessitated and forced the creation of those laws in the first place.
The text notes, with sharp psychological insight, everyone believes his craft to be the true one. The judge thinks history is a courtroom. The philosopher thinks history is a seminar.
And this highlights the immense danger of hyper-specialization. When we isolate ourselves in specific roles, particularly purely analytical or mental ones, we lose sight of the entire material horizon.
The ideologist takes a concept, violently rips it away from the physical conditions that generated it, and treats that orphan concept as if it were the creator of reality itself. It's standing the world on its head.
And this has profound implications for anyone listening right now. If your daily practice consists entirely of sitting at a desk, moving spreadsheets around, theorizing in meetings, or debating concepts online, without ever being forced to test those concepts against the friction of physical reality, you are in a highly precarious position.
You are literally severing your connection to the mechanism of truth. You are risking what the text dramatically but accurately calls moral death.
Your consciousness becomes spurious because it lacks the abrasive, corrective friction of material practice. You start believing your own imagined tilers are real money.
But if we fully accept this epistemology, if we agree that human knowledge only expands in tandem with our active practical mastery over nature through industry and experimentation, we are forced to confront a terrifying corollary.
What happens to human cognition, to our very capacity to know the truth, when the fundamental nature of our practical activity drastically changes?
If practice makes knowledge, we have to take a hard look at what modern practice actually looks like. And this leads us to our final lingering thought. We've charted an immense journey through these texts today.
We really have.
We started by dismantling the idealist illusion of pure thought, realizing that you cannot logically deduce a physical apple tree from a blank intellectual void. We uncovered the materialist premise that life determines consciousness, that the desperate physical act of eating a sheep precedes the linguistic concept of usefulness.
We smashed through the agnostic interface of the unknowable universe, proving that human beings can grasp objective reality because experimentation and industry synthesizing alizarin and discovering Neptune allow us to alter and master nature.
And we explored the insidious trap of spurious consciousness, learning how the division of labor tricks desk-bound thinkers into mistaking their isolated concepts for reality itself.
It is a muscular, demanding, profoundly active theory of knowledge. It dictates that to know a thing, you must interact with it, change it, and make it serve a human purpose. Observation is never enough.
But I want to leave you with a provocation, drawing on some deeply unsettling notes from volume 33 of the Sources. Marx quotes a man named Andrew Wu, who wrote a book celebrating the rise of the early factory system.
Ure enthusiastically, almost religiously, describes the Herculean enterprise of factory discipline. He talks about how the modern manufacturer, armed with massive capital and applied science, actively seeks to reduce the human worker to a mere automaton.
And it's important to understand that Ure isn't criticizing this, he is boasting about it. He states explicitly that the ultimate goal of the factory system is to completely replace the independent will, the localized judgment, and the varied physical exertion of the skilled craftsman with the unvarying, mindless, repetitive regularity of a machine.
Ure writes an incredible sentence that should really stop you in your tracks. Ignorance is the mother of industry as well as of superstition.
He argues that perfection in manufacturing consists of the ability to proceed entirely without consulting the mind of the worker. The factory is meticulously designed so that the human beings are downgraded to fleshy, interchangeable components of the engine.
It represents the ultimate violent separation of mental and physical labor pushed to an industrial extreme. The intelligence, the knowledge of the process, is built into the architecture of the machine and entirely stripped away from the human being operating it. The worker's practice becomes fundamentally unthinking.
So here's the question you need to carry with you. If this entire epistemology, our very biological and philosophical ability to know the world, depends entirely on our active, conscious, practical interaction with it, what happens to human knowledge when our daily practice is reduced to just being a passive, ignorant cog in a vast mechanical system?
If the system explicitly demands that ignorance is the mother of industry, does the relentless drive toward hyperautomation and the systematic stripping of judgment from our daily labor actually threaten our very capacity to comprehend the world?
If an algorithm does the thinking and a robot does the physical alteration of nature, where does that leave human consciousness? If we stop consciously altering nature with our own hands and minds, do we lose our grip on truth itself? Are we right now actively building a new digital version of Kant's locked box, sealing ourselves inside an interface where we can never touch base reality again?
We are back on the edge of the pool. The machines might be executing the perfect freestyle stroke for us, but if we never feel the shock of the cold water, do we even know what water is anymore?
Thank you for joining us on this deep dive into the source material. We hope it gave you a new lens through which to view your own daily practice. Don't just sit in the abstract ether. Go out, experiment, get your hands dirty, and test your ideas against the relentless friction of the real world. We'll see you next time.